All right. We will go ahead and get going as we do have a full set of full hour of information here. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this State of Housing webinar. We are looking forward to sharing our insights and facilitating a conversation with key leaders in the housing space here in Houston to help us grapple with the findings from this year's report. The Kinder Institute for Urban Research published the 2023 State of Housing in Harris County and Houston report back in July, so it's been out for a couple months now. This year's report was the fourth iteration of this report, and all four of those years have been made possible by the generous support of our friends over at Wells Fargo, and we do appreciate that support. For today, what we're hoping to do is we're going to spend a little bit of time touching on key findings from this year's report. We're then going to unveil our State of Housing Data Dashboard. That dashboard is going to contain all the information that we're sharing out today, as well as some additional ones, and my colleague will go into more detail on that here in a second. And then finally, for the bulk of our time today, we're going to have a discussion with some panelists here, leaders in our housing sector here in Houston. We'll have an opportunity to ask some questions based off of what we're learning from this year's report, as well as an opportunity to get questions from you all, the audience. And so if you all do have questions as we are going through, please feel free to get those questions added to the Q&A button. Those questions, you can upvote them, you can downvote them. I don't know if you can downvote them actually, but you can upvote them for sure. And that'll help us know which questions you would like for the panelists to be asked. We really appreciate everybody joining us for today's conversation. And so with no further delay, let us get going with our first point, which is to touch on some of the key findings from this year's State of Housing report. And for that, I'd like to introduce Kinder Institute's research scientist, Dr. Steve Sherman. Steve?
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to get the ball rolling. So rather than previous year's reports, which took a broader look at the home ownership and renting market in Harris County and Houston, plus other issues in the local housing system, this year's report focused exclusively on renters and renting. And this focus arose in conversation with an advisory committee of leaders from various local housing-centered agencies, both public and private. There are many other issues identified as well, which might be broached in the panel, but the focus of the report itself narrowed on to renting. There were many reasons for this, but one that stands out is that we're a majority rental city. Close to 60% of Houston households are renters, and 45% and climbing every year in the overall county are renters too. And what is also climbing, besides the sheer number of rental households, is the amount of rent itself, which increased 30% in only 6 years in the city of Houston, and about the same percentage in the county overall. And this was more than the increase in wages. Through this brief presentation, I'm going to talk through the report's main findings, centering not just on rental affordability, but also the broader question about just how stable and secure living as a renter is. If we are a renter city, the stability of renters' lives is a matter of paramount concern. This is a quick presentation, and I implore you to check out the full report online for more details and methodology as well. Sarah's already linked it in the chat. We'll start with one of the report's anchoring findings, which featured a new way to evaluate if a renter household is spending too much on rent. The usual assumption is that a household is overpaying on rent if they're paying more than 30% of their income, which entails that that remaining 70% goes towards life's other needs and necessities. But there are problems with this 30% share approach for measuring cost burden. That's the word for this. First, it flattens the differences in household incomes. 30% of $200,000 is a lot different than 30% of $20,000. Secondly, that leftover money after rent doesn't go as far if you're a household that has more people. There are more mouths to feed, more food bills, more medical bills, more transportation bills. And third, the cost of a lot of essential non-housing goods like food and transportation has gone up a lot in recent years. I don't need to tell it to anyone attending this webinar. So this report employed a methodology from other housing researchers at Harvard that accounted for these other factors and found that rather than 51% of renter households being cost burdened in Harris County, It's more like 60%, or 3 in 5 of Harris County renter households have a tough time paying the bills after meeting that month's rent. When the Harvard Joint Center methodology is applied, these numbers differ extensively on cost burden by family status and also by race and ethnicity. Almost 90% of single-parent renter households and almost 75% of two-parent renter households are cost burdened, compared to only 55% of single-person households. So the renter affordability crisis is hitting families with children at a higher rate. Almost 300,000 renter households with kids are cost burdened in the county. And also, by breaking out the numbers by race and ethnicity of the household head, one sees that about 2/3 of Black renter households and 3/4 of Latino renter households are cost burdened, which is more than 350,000 households, about 1/5 of all households, renter or owner, in the county. That is a lot of people. And a high cost burden population means that building savings, either for just security or a rainy day fund or for a down payment for a home, is hard for many county residents. So even if homeownership is a good investment, it's becoming increasingly untenable locally. So let's do the math to see how untenable. Per the county median renter household income, which is about $45,000 a year, an affordable home in 2022 would cost about $127,000. You see that number up there. However, the median home price in the county in 2022 was $317,500. That gap, that difference between what a home costs and what a median renter can afford, grew 41% in just 1 year, from 2021 to 2022. Now, homes went up in price, not that much, but interest rates went up, meaning that the loan became harder to secure. So we're likely going to be continuing renting here in Houston and Harris County. And thus I return to the question that I asked earlier: how secure is renting in Harris County? And I'm turning back to the report for answers. Our rising and high cost eviction numbers would suggest that renting is not secure, and that high rates of cost burden rents are putting renters at risk for eviction, particularly after 2022, when the COVID era renter protections largely expired. So previous Kinder research has pointed to Harris County being a national leader in evictions, and we had about 80,000 in 2022. And one interesting finding in this year's report centered on the geography of evictions within Harris County. So unsurprisingly, eviction numbers were highest in neighborhoods with a lot of rental households and more moderate income. So the most eviction filings in 2022 were in the Eldridge, Spring Southwest, and West Chase areas. But eviction filings grew more as a percent, actually, in higher income, lower renter communities when measured extensively. So here's a table featuring the neighborhoods where eviction filings increased the most as a percentage, noting the different denominators, between 2020 and 2022. So number one is the Washington Memorial Park area. And you can see some highlighted neighborhoods that one doesn't usually see on the list of neighborhoods facing housing stability challenges locally. Like, for example, if you're not from Houston, one of these neighborhoods is where James Harden, the basketball player, has a house. So this raises questions about who is evicting. I want to focus a little bit on landlords in this year's report. I focused on one smaller set because it's a big topic: single-family rentals, because they've been identified in past reports as a growing part of the local rental market. And our findings identified over 10,000 homes owned by just 15 large interstate investors identified in an Amherst Capital report. So these include well-known companies like Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, Progress Residential. And this 10,000 actually doesn't account for the 40,000 other homes owned by LLCs that didn't have the capacity to link to larger corporate actors. So amongst these 15 companies, their investments are almost entirely beyond Beltway 8 in the county's periphery. And the report's analysis also found that even when controlling for other factors, neighborhoods with more homes owned by these companies had higher eviction filing rates. And while their overall footprint is small, less than 4% of single-family rentals countywide, there are some neighborhoods where they own hundreds of homes and close to 1/6 of all single-family rental stock. This raises questions about the challenges that local home buyers would face trying to buy homes in these neighborhoods as they're bidding against, multi-billion-dollar investment trusts and private equity firms. The report's last finding on rental stability didn't look at finances, but the building condition of rental properties. I know local journalists have covered this a lot recently. In this report, we isolate two extensive measures of habitability: building age, accounting for renovations, and the building condition grade from our local appraiser. HCAD is the acronym. There are, by our estimates, about 330,000 rental structures, not units, in the county, and about 1/5 are below average quality per HCAD's metrics. Additionally, about 30% of the entire rental building stock was built only in this 15-year period about 40 to 55 years ago, and hasn't had significant renovations since, per HCAD data, which raises pressing concerns and questions about this aging rental stock. And per the report's extensive analysis, communities with more habitability issues were more likely to have more Hispanic and foreign-born residents, be less populated, and have more moderate incomes. And as the map shows, there's a concentration east of downtown of many communities where more than 50% of rental structures were below average quality. And before turning it over to our panelists to discuss these findings and how they relate to their work, I'd like to point you towards two things. First, a lot more detail about the methodology in these numbers, along with many other notable findings, is in the text for this year's report, which you can access via that QR code or by the link in the chat. You can also access through that page an interactive dashboard produced by the members of our Urban Data Platform team, who I want to publicly thank for their very hard work here. And this has all of the data used in this year's report down to the neighborhood level, which you can either map or download in an Excel file and use for your own curiosity or research. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dan Potter and our esteemed panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing those findings with us. A very quick update on our dashboard. I am getting information that our dashboard was so popular, it has crashed the internet. Actually, perhaps not the entire internet. We would not be here if that were the case. But unfortunately, Tableau Public, which is the platform that we are utilizing for that dashboard in order to make it accessible to as many people as possible, that happens to be down right now. So if you are trying to access Tableau, our dashboard that runs through Tableau Public, unfortunately, that's not available right now, but it will be back up as soon as Tableau Public itself is back up. So just a little FYI there. Thank you once more, Steve, for helping us to understand some of the highlights in our report, to unpack those highlights and to help better understand what they mean for us here in Houston and beyond. We are joined here today by three fantastic housing experts who happen to be located here in the Houston area. And so welcome panelists for today's conversation. We are joined by Cupid Alexander, Senior Vice President of Operations at the Houston Housing Authority. Also, we are joined by Laura Jaramillo, Executive Director of the Houston Office of the Local Initiatives Support Corporation. And finally, we are joined by Libby Vieira Bland, Director of Neighborhood Development with Project Row Houses here in Houston. Thank you to each one of you for joining us this morning. With that in mind, I welcome you all to very quickly love to learn a little bit more about your background, if you could introduce yourself, and how do you fit into this housing space here in Houston?
I guess I'll start. So Cupid Alexander, Senior Vice President of Operations. At the Houston Housing Authority, we have a very talented group of individuals who work from a waiting list for individuals who qualify for federal programs. So we have a board. I believe our board chair is on this call watching. And we have our CEO and president, but we also have partners within the community, private landlords who allow our clients to rent. So a lot of this is completely relevant. I know we'll get more into it, but I just wanted to give a high-level overview of what the Houston Housing Authority is and what we do.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Laura Jaramillo, and I've spent most of my career in the community development world, first in the financial industry space at Chase and at Wells Fargo, managing community relations and social responsibility teams, and now in the nonprofit sector. As executive director of one of the largest CDFIs in the country, our focus at LISC Houston is building sustainable communities through comprehensive community development. And just this week, we are launching an intense 18-month program for emerging developers of color. And the plan is for this first cohort of around 25 to go out and make an impact in Houston's housing market for everyone. So I think being on this nonprofit side after the for-profit side has me better rounded in this housing discussion.
Good morning, I'm Libby Vieira Bland. As the Director of Neighborhood Development for Project Row Houses, I focus explicitly on the management and development of affordable rental units for the Third Ward. We focus explicitly on community members who are making below 70% of the area median income. Project Row Houses as a whole, however, is an arts-based nonprofit. We do a lot of work in providing community resources, community education, and a lot of just community fun programming.
Awesome. Well, welcome to each of you again. Let's get into some questions. So Cupid, I want to start with you. So thinking about the theme of rent versus income and cost burden, the equation's clearly out of balance. Rents are outpacing incomes, and that's leading to increased cost burden. And that cost is experienced in the city of Houston and Harris County. So how is this impacting the work of the Houston Housing Authority's affordable housing programs?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we have to recognize is that all of us are being asked to do more with less. So not only, like you mentioned, Dr. Potter, that people are becoming rent burden, they're becoming cost burden, and they're usually becoming this in place. So we have rent burden, so that means more than 30% of your income is being used for your rent, becoming extremely rent burden where it's 40 and 50 and 60%. So what that means is that there's less, it's a trickle effect. There's less of your financial resources. You know, that feeling where you're like, man, my money is just not moneying. It's not going far enough. That is what everyone is feeling. What that means for the Houston Housing Authority is that we expect our waiting list to grow when we open them up. We expect that we have to leverage our dollars with partners a lot more efficiently, but there's going to be that there has to be more money because that gulf between what people have and what people need is continuing to grow.
Yeah. So Laura, if we pivot to you, so Cupid's given us a little bit of background about how that experience with cost burden plays out for the renter space. That also translates when it comes to home buying. And so how does the rising cost burden affect the ability for folks to start building that nest egg, perhaps, that's going to go towards eventually purchasing a home, and what efforts are underway that might help address some of this gap?
Well, it definitely does pose a challenge as we're trying to encourage more home ownership, right? One of the ways we're at LISC Houston trying to encourage more home buying is through a collaborative approach we've been calling the Harris County Housing Collaborative, or HCHC. When we launched this at the end of last year, the market was obviously in a different place. You talked about rising interest rates. So with rising housing costs and the interest rates and a real shortage of affordable housing supply, it's a challenge. But in the long run, we know building assets through home ownership is the key to generational wealth. And that doesn't happen easily as a renter, right? Or at all as a renter. So HCHC is addressing various strategies whose ultimate goal is to get people of color into homes. And some of that is through education. Basic education has such a huge role in this. So by educating our citizens early, we can address some of the issues that we know that as a renter, some of the things are out of your control. As an educated homeowner, you can expect more of it, of what is coming ahead, right? The change in your payments. So educating people early on to understand the process of home buying and the potential barriers, including some systemic barriers. we can prepare them better. So we're trying to find better affordable loan products as well as housing products to make them available to everyone. And we want to share that, yes, mortgage rates may rise, as I was mentioning earlier, just like rents, but with a mortgage and with education, you know better what to expect. So we will be launching a new brand and a site on October 4th to be a resource to anyone interested and at any stage in home buying. So more to come on that announcement, but collaboration and education are key. And our partners in that collaborative include the experts like Habitat for Humanity and Tejano Center and Avenue, TSHAC, the City of Houston, the county, so many more. These are all experts in this arena who are collaborating to make this work happen.
So we're hearing from Cupid about how this is impacting renters. We're hearing from Laura about how this is impacting sort of the renters moving into the home buyer space, and we're hearing about some individual impacts of cost burden. Libby, I want to turn to you because I guess I'm curious to get your insights around how does this cost burden and higher cost of housing problem affect the development of new affordable housing options? Sort of that building more. I guess in some ways we've been talking about demand side. What about supply side? And where is support coming that might be able to help close some of that gap when it comes to that building and developing more affordable housing?
We're really seeing that cost burden is impacting us on all sides of the equation here. The cost to develop a unit of affordable housing that's truly intended to be affordable housing is too high to be practical in most situations without an extreme subsidy. It's increasingly difficult because there are barriers to receiving federal funding. LIHTC funding, low-income housing tax credit funding can be very competitive and difficult to get. Community development block grant funding can be caught up in politics. Something we're seeing on the local level right now and over the last few years is the community development block grant funding that was coming through the disaster recovery vein is getting caught between the city and the state. We are one of many nonprofit, small scale developers who lost funding that was supposed to be coming from the Harvey recovery funding in the last few years. And as we're seeing just last week, that funding that was funneled into the single family development program has also now been caught up in the same set of politics. And that program has now been defunded and discontinued. It's very difficult to make a plan for developing out more affordable housing without knowing where those partnerships can truly be formed for rental units.
So it sounds like, it sounds like there is a tension here where there are organizations looking to enter into this space of creating more affordable housing, but that the funding's just not quite there. So if we're thinking about like other entities involved in the creation and building out of some new affordable housing, Cupid, I'm kind of looking at you on this one because I'm thinking the Houston Housing Authority, there's some role there as well for you all. So how do you all think about this development of new affordable housing?
Well, I think one of the things is that it's going to take everyone, right? So as Libby was talking about the financial capital stacking, so the instruments that are used to buy down the costs, that has to change. One of the good things that the Houston Housing Authority has done is that there was something called the PFC program. And I know it was embattled a little bit. It's Public Facilities Corporation, but it allows us to have those restricted rents in units in a diversified space. So there are going to have to be continued different use of financial resources. And sometimes it's going to take a little bit of politics. I saw some of the questions in the Q&A. I took a little look at it. And some people said, hey, how are you guys going to create subsidized or affordable units that are guaranteed? And usually that comes as an earmark through a financial investment into a buy down of the development that says, hey, if we give you this money, you're going to have these affordable units. What we're seeing from this report is that we're going to need more and more of this. So I think that everyone here would probably agree on this call that increasing the housing stock is one of the ways. It's not the only way. They say you can't build your way out of a housing emergency. And what that means is that there are multiple different investments that are going to be needed, including policy, including financial investments, including philanthropy, including the data analysis to show that as this community grows up and grows out, it continues to assist the residents that it needs. So at the Houston Housing Authority, I think we're doing a great job of trying to use information like this to direct where our investments are going to go.
Okay, so I think I heard a key word there that I'm wondering if we can maybe poke at for a second more, which is policy. And so, Laura, thinking about some of your experience both in the, on the for-profit side and now in the nonprofit side, kind of offers you an interesting purview of what policies could help in this situation. So what are some of those policy pieces that maybe need to get put in place for us to start really grappling with this housing crisis we're faced with here in Houston?
Yeah, one of the strategies of the collaborative I mentioned before, HCHC, is around heirs and tangled titles. And so just providing guidance and resources for home preservation by resolving those issues, right? The tangled titles and the deed issues is critical to our collaborative, as well as advocating for some of the changes in systemic barriers to home ownership. So that can be higher wages, student loan relief, mortgage denials and underwriting policies there. So those are long-term goals for the collaborative, but they are ones that we are talking about.
Oh, so that's really interesting that some of the policies you're pointing at, it's not just about, hey, write a housing policy. It's recognizing that if we're thinking about that cost of housing, there really is this balance to strike between understanding that the student loan debt, the credit card debt, the other subsidies that might help support with childcare, these other costs in our lives are what also have that rippling effect into the housing space. And so for us to talk through policy as it relates to housing doesn't just necessarily mean it's housing policy, period. We can have this much more holistic look. Again, thinking creative ways to make sure that we're moving beyond just that thought of housing policy, period, to understanding the holistic picture of it. So Libby, we started to hear a little bit just now about some of the other different expenses that people are faced with and the way that ripples. And so, as given some of your experience, some of the clients that Project Row Houses works with, when we're thinking about here in the Houston communities, and people are having to make some hard decisions right now about how to make ends meet. How does housing cost burden sort of play out in real life? We're sort of talking policy implications, talking these sort of societal levers, but can we bring it back to the person? How are individuals experiencing this cost burden?
I think humanizing this issue is so important here. When we think about this on a really minute level, I have friends, I have family who just in the last month have been trying to debate, when bills are coming up right now, next week my mortgage is due, next week my car note is due. Which bill can I afford to put off and not be at risk of losing that asset in the service of my family? If I don't pay my car note, are they going to repossess my car next week? Is it more important to pay the mortgage as opposed to, worrying about late fees on that later to make sure we all have a place to lay our heads tonight? How are we affording childcare this month? Am I going to have to leave my kids in, some less than safe situations, which those are stories we see on the news every week, every day about people who are put into really difficult positions. They're just trying to make the best decisions they can for their families. They have to go to work. That's the reality of the situation. And so what are the things that have to go by the wayside in the meantime?
Yeah, some of those questions and challenges that some of us are fortunate enough not to have to grapple with, but far too many of us are grappling with on a weekly, if not daily basis. Absolutely, and recognizing that while we're talking stats and numbers, there are humans and families with children and the elderly behind a lot of this that we don't want to lose sight of in that. So thank you for that, Libby. So Laura, in thinking about this notion of cost burden, we are talking about housing. We are recognizing that cost burden spreads throughout. It's not just about what is my mortgage or what is my rent. What are perhaps, the non-housing groups that if Houston, and again, recognizing that this conversation extends beyond just our city limits. So if Houston or other cities around the country are trying to grapple with their affordability challenges, who else needs to be at the table? We've hinted at it, but who are these other non-housing groups?
Yeah, good question, Dan, and a very important one. When you hear the anecdotal stories that Libby provided, it's all about this social determinants of health that we keep hearing about, that where you live matters. We've all heard the disparities it causes to our education, which is basically impacting our workforce and our health and life expectancy and so much more, that all in the end impacts our economic stability in Houston. And that's why it means our hospital systems and our corporate partners, our philanthropic partners, Metro Transit, schools, all of our community need to be a part of the conversation about affordability. So we are working with funders and with organizations who realize there's a need for the entirety of Houston to be engaged in this issue. We know that today there is this collaborative group that is trying to come together to talk about how they can have a role in it. Everyone has a role. So in breaking that cycle of intergenerational poverty to safeguard our economic future, the tools, the opportunities all have to be available to everyone. So everyone deserves a clean and safe home, but it's hard when you have to make those decisions, right? So as an example of what we're trying to do with Metro is work with Metro on their transit-oriented development discussions to ensure that they have the piece of the community understanding this exactly, and that when they are considering construction of a housing project, that they consider including childcare there on the site, so that a working mom can drop off her kiddos before she hops on the transit to get to work, or the one less thing she has to worry about, that she can drop her other child off at school on her way to work. So having the conversations and convening the organizations around the need in our community is happening, but it's a slow start, I think. So all of that is relevant to the work that we are doing at LISC Houston.
Yeah, this problem, of housing affordability impacts all aspects of our lives, and so in some ways it requires all aspects of our lives coming together to help try to resolve it.
Yeah, Dr. Dan, there's one thing, and I kind of want to add to what Laura was saying,
please.
Is that as you're thinking about the neighborhoods and we're thinking about housing and people as the infrastructure, we were talking about capital stacking, AKA where you get the money from, but there's something called the Community Reinvestment Act that banks are required to do. But you do not have this funding mechanism if you do not have a bank in your neighborhood, right? So there is a requirement to have an investment mechanism back in the local community, but this is very, very difficult when you do not have a banking institution within the community in which they could funnel some of their Community Reinvestment Act dollars into the community. So as we're thinking about how do you invest in people through infrastructure, right? Because infrastructure means nothing if it doesn't serve the people. And humanizing what Libby said, it's also saying, where's the money going to come from? If you're thinking about all of the different funding mechanisms, it's like, well, how do we increase the ability to have these funding mechanisms in parts of these communities?
It reminds me of some of the updates that have happened recently with CMS and reimbursements, where now there's options for homelessness is actually an option now that various different healthcare providers can check. And so opening up new avenues, I think Cupid, to build off of your comment, that idea of opening up new avenues of funding, recognizing that no one has a check large enough to write to resolve this immediately, but that by bringing in these additional resources that are available and ensuring that when we're building them out in different places, that they're going into those neighborhoods of need.
Well, and Dr. Dan, I think one of the things we have to be honest about is that the housing environment has changed, right? So let's think about Airbnb and Vacasa's impact on the supply. So people have to be somewhere. Formerly, where people used to maybe rent for a room for someone for a low cost, now that's been privatized. Not saying that that's a bad thing, but it's a reality because there were boarding houses, there were quads. Now people can take units offline meaning that, hey, Houston is a very popular place. There's lots of events going on. I can rent this out over a weekend and get as much for rent in one weekend that I would usually get in a month. what impact does that play, right? And the other thing is that when Dr. Steve Sherman was mentioning in his stats, he said, hey, the rent moratorium also ended. So we knew that people, they had a pause in their income, but that debt not necessarily was forgiven. So at the Housing Authority, we're working to make sure that we have mitigation upstream. So how do we get ahead of it? Because it costs more for someone to get out of homelessness than to prevent them from going into homelessness. And I think that there's so many different things that COVID changed and the market changed in our economy. So the economy is a measure of the work. The economy isn't just something that exists in and of itself, but in these changes, how are we adjusting to meet communities where they are? So it goes from, we think about it as mobility versus transience. So transience is like, oh, I'm only here for a little bit because I can't afford to be here, versus how do we change our society to being like, hey, I can be where I want, and there's something affordable in a lot of sections within our market economy.
Yes, and I, thinking about some of how you're talking about COVID changing things for us, and the role, where we see homelessness, where we see the additional costs. I think, all of these things sort of intersect onto another theme I want to kind of pivot us towards, which is that of evictions, right? Is when we were seeing some numbers earlier, and anybody who's tracking this right now is seeing that that moratorium that was put into place during COVID, did not get rid of evictions. We should not misrepresent what it was doing, but it definitely looks to have appeared to suppress the numbers. And coming out of the pandemic, we see sort of a new normal. And so I guess I want to open up a question for all of you as we're thinking about evictions and what this really quite frankly, unsettling trend of eviction numbers look like here in Houston, and we can look around the rest of the country to see some similar stuff in other big cities. What's going on with evictions here in the Houston area and the Houston region, and how should housing advocates, housing entities be dealing with this crisis of evictions that we're facing?
I think, Dan, one of the strategies, again, back to the collaborative I mentioned, HCHC, is around heirs and the tangled title. So again, I said basic education, we're trying to help out. We have a leadership program at LISC, Train the Trainer. It's a development program we've offered over the years to build leaders in their communities. And they are then going out into their communities and educating, and that program, the leadership class, chooses an initiative to focus on. One of the cohorts recently took on an initiative to educate tenants on the eviction process. So the more they learn, the more they spread the word, the more prepared. But that's just a really small step, but it is an effort for our own communities to help each other.
Absolutely. We see this new normal. And so in some ways, how are we responding to it? And so that education piece and that train the trainers thing. Cupid, I don't mean to put you on the spot with HHA, but evictions are a reality for you all as well.
Right. Dr. Dan, shameless plug, behind the scenes, we're working with Kinder Institute and an entity out of Boston to see if we can stabilize our renters who have non-payment of rent. So we're saying, can we infuse repayment agreements that are 0%, just to get them out of the hole, because we know COVID interrupted so many things for so many people's lives. So it's these creative partnerships where I think landlords are also saying, it costs me more to evict someone in some situations, especially for non-payment, if these amounts can be mitigated somewhere. So, with us at the Houston Housing Authority, our primary concern, and one of the ways that we tell people, is that we're like a talent agent. We don't get paid unless we're paying rent. We have no incentive to actually put people anywhere but in a unit. We literally get this money that way, but we know we're going to need creative partnerships. Again, when I was reading some of the chat, there's a lot of good things that people are saying. They're asking a lot of good questions. I know we're going to get to them. I want to create some space for Libby, but I know with the Houston Housing Authority, I think our board chair and our CEO, David Northern, so Lorenz Snowden and David Northern, are really, really focused on stabilizing the community. I sum it up in 3 ways: protect, preserve, and produce.
Thank you for that, Cupid. So Libby, thinking about we're talking about the large numbers of evictions, but again, we're missing the who, and I wonder, like, who is being impacted by these evictions going on here in Houston?
I don't want to flatten that question, because I think it's everybody. We're seeing families, we're seeing seniors, single men, single mothers. Everybody is being impacted by this issue. Cost burden knows no bounds. And I want to pull back here because I think it's important to note the state of Texas is relatively unique in that there are very, very few renter protections in this state. And in the city of Houston, people who are going before eviction court proceedings are not guaranteed legal representation. I know that Harris County and Precinct 1 in particular have been working on this issue really closely. And so for housing advocates, I think that a very good angle to take right now is proactive partnerships with those sorts of entities, with Precinct 1, with justices of the peace who are more interested in ensuring rental rights, rental protections for Houston residents.
And Dr. Dan, one thing that I think we talked about behind the scenes was that we know that eviction is one of the ways that people are displaced, but there's something called a stipulated agreement. So it is a way where, and if you all are readers, there's a book called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. But one of the ways that evictions happen in a non-judicial way is what's called a stipulated agreement. It says, hey, if you leave, you pay me a little bit of money, I don't take you to eviction. Sometimes it scares people, and we know that's one of the ways that is hardest to measure. So even though we're seeing a large amount of evictions, we're also seeing a large amount of stipulated agreements that might even be greater than evictions as we're seeing this transience.
Yeah, it's one of those, the numbers will only tell us but so much, and that there's that lingering question of what sort of displacement, what sort of mobility or transient, to use the word Cupid you were using earlier, is flying under our radar here. So I want to provide us with some time to work on some audience questions, but I feel like we'd be remiss if we didn't at least take a moment to acknowledge that as we've talked about housing affordability, as we've talked about this question of eviction, there is this additional lingering challenge about housing quality, that even as the housing affordability stock, affordable housing stock in Houston shrinks, what is still affordable, what kind of quality is it? And so, Libby, I know, prior to Project Row Houses, you did some works with Texas Housers on environmental justice and housing, and that, the way in which health and housing and quality intersect. So when you think about the concentration of Harris County's older and potentially lower quality housing, if we recall the map that Steve shared with us earlier, concentrated there in the east and northeast side of town, what are some issues and concerns that we need to be thinking about when it comes to our residents here in Houston and Harris County?
Yeah, the biggest issue is just that layering of impact that we're seeing, the layering of inequality. The same neighborhoods that are going to have the highest cost burden, the highest mortgage burden, are also going to be those same neighborhoods that are seeing the biggest issues with deferred maintenance of their homes. If you're already in a position where you're saying, well, I can't really afford childcare, I can't really afford medical care, I'm already debating if I can make my mortgage payment or not, you're not going to be able to replace your roof when the shingles start coming off. You're not going to be able to replace the windows when, it's not as sealed and it's letting in elements, or it's letting in air in an uneven manner. And so when the next disaster comes, which inevitably in Houston, it does come, and flooding comes into that neighborhood, you are going to be a lot less likely in those communities to be able to qualify for FEMA assistance, because they're going to come in and do their insurance assessment of your home and say, well, this roof looks like it's been damaged for years. Why would we pay for that? They're going to disqualify all of those homeowners from all of the benefits that they need in order to be in a safer home for the next disaster that's coming in a few years after that. It's all tied into those social determinants of health. Laura was mentioning this earlier. We see these same issues layered on top of each other in these same communities over and over and over again. And it's the unfortunate reality of environmental justice. communities of color, older communities in particular, are at the most risk.
So I want to pivot, because I think this is a great segue into some of our questions that we're hearing from our audience. And I'm just going to start with the one that got the most upvotes. So we see here that we've got some investors coming into the area, and those investors are pulling properties off the market. But there is this quality piece too, and I feel like these are linked in some ways when it comes to this notion of affordable housing. And so, at the end of the day, I think what this question starts to boil down to us with is, given the enormity of the problem, what do you all view as reasonable expectations for local government to be able to do when it comes to stepping into this space? Again, I don't want to make it a government versus economy per se, or the market per se, but what role does local government have here? And what are the best ways for us to locally help make sure Houstonians have housing that they can afford?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one, right? Because in some of the comments, there was a notice that someone had mentioned municipal districts, right? So what they were asking is, like, government has a way of incentivizing development by giving you an exemption, so giving you a discount, so a limited tax exemption over a certain amount of years. I think one of the things that people have conversation points about is about how much governance is needed in this space, right? So it's like, I'm a West Coaster. I'm from a city called Portland, Oregon. We had different tax exemptions for home ownership. You think of it as homesteading tax exemptions, but we also had it from limited tax exemptions for multifamily buildings. The whole goal was, how do we incentivize building these buildings? I think that that's a safe space. I know at the Houston Housing Authority, our staff is very, very focused on how do we use this information to leverage with partners who might get some of these discounts, right? But I think that if we're talking about policy, I'll rely on my colleagues on this call, on this conversation, how you get upstream to say whether the policies that are needed. One of the things I know we're focused on at the Houston Housing Authority is that if you have a voucher, landlords do not have to rent to you. It's called source of income discrimination, right? So it has nothing really to do with your ability to pay, but everything to do with your status because of this voucher. That's one of the safe spaces I can say that we're looking at through our leadership, and our staff is, and the rest of it is policies. So I'll create some space for others to kind of chime in.
I have to be careful as a CDFI on what I say as well on policy issues, but when you think about some of the properties that are not well maintained, who are the owners there, and just trying to get to who actually owns them, and then how do we get them to improve that property, right? Is there a way to graciously shame them into doing the right thing for the community? But we have at LISC been listening to the community for over a year, convening a group of organizations, people who are interested in this the NOAH, the naturally occurring affordable housing issue, and how that's impacting their communities. And so we are actually we're in discussions around this and about potentially standing up a fund to help established organizations deal with the acquisition of those properties. And it's in the discussion, and we hope that there are enough investors and interest in setting up this fund so that nonprofit developers can acquire the property and continue to do their work on the community side. They're faced with whether to raise the rents or cut services or even evict when they can't maintain the properties themselves because of rising property rates and taxes. Insurance is a huge issue with some of the developers, the nonprofit developers, and everyone basically. So trying to get at how to get the existing properties to lift up into a decent place to live, and if not, to move on and sell them to our other developers who will do that for the community. So again, we're working on it, and it's not easy work.
I think that there's a lot of room here to look at creating policies that would incentivize better quality housing. It would incentivize improving maintenance of housing. If we were to work on the front end and say, if you're meeting these standards, if you agree to inspections on, a much more regular basis, then maybe that qualifies you for a property tax exemption or reduction or something to that extent. Certainly, as a housing developer, I would love to see more policies in place for small scale developers. It's simply not possible for us to compete in the LIHTC arena with the larger scale developers who really have the funds to draw from. So creating policies that would target developers or even small scale homeowners who are looking at wanting to purchase additional homes that they can rent out. Those sorts of solutions really answer a minute need in micro neighborhoods that larger scale developers are also not able to meet. I think that we need to be looking at a multi-fit. I think that we need to be, sorry, I'm going to start that sentence over. I think that we need to be looking at many sizes meets the need. COVID brain is starting to set in a little bit.
Yeah,
I'm recovering from
Libby,
COVID.
I hear you. I hear you.
I'm trying to get at a point of saying we need to be attacking this situation from all different arenas, all different angles. We need to be saying, small scale developers can meet this issue, large scale developers can meet the issue from another angle.
Yeah, so I want to back up what Libby was saying, because it's like a comprehensive plan that's scalable, right? That's also gentle, right? So what I'm trying to say is this: there are opportunities. What Dr. Steve had brought up for everybody on this call is that there's dilapidated housing. Laura mentioned this. Developers are going to snatch that up because they can flip that around because of the demand. I'm not mad at that, but that presents an opportunity for preservation. So there's going to be an opportunity for preservation of some of these properties, kind of like neighborhood preservation. So we do have models out there that currently exist that people can use. We need those scaled up, because if you do not have the actual supply, knowing that the market has changed, eventually everyone is going to become cost burden, move further out, or just not have the flexibility. And what we're trying to capture is that these systems have to capture that feeling, because people might not be able to articulate it, but they feel it. They're like, man, I used to be able to find 10 rentals over here. Now I can't find one for myself. And then it's going to be a Class C or Class D property. So it's like, how do you use these tools to scale up in real time the dilapidated housing that we know is already there, especially on the east side? One of the things, and this is a shameless plug, the Houston Housing Authority is not getting rid of CUNY homes. In fact, we're increasing the amount of units that are affordable over there and creating homeownership opportunities through a community-led development process. So I saw that here. I want to put that, you all can record that. My board chair is on, the CEO is on, we report to HUD. We are in the business of housing. So how we do it has changed, but it serves us no purpose when we know this need is there, and that's our mission.
So I'm hearing kind of a push towards a lot of carrots for people: incentivize the maintenance, incentivize the upkeep, incentivize the affordable housing. Are there any sticks that are needed? There was a suggestion made around something like rent freeze, rent control. Maybe this is just a softball lob. Is rent control an option for Houston when it comes to addressing affordable housing?
For Houston, unfortunately, no. I spent a lot of time in New York. I am a big fan of rent control as an option. I think that Houston is such a developer-centric city that it just isn't likely that we're going to see policies that are that renter focused anytime soon.
I'm seeing other nods. So okay, I just wanted to put it out there in case I didn't know that answer. So before we wrap up, one question that came in that I thought was interesting is calling forward the fact that we are 1/4 of our population are foreign-born, coming into our city from not just another part of the country, from another part of the world. And a lot of them grappling very directly with the high cost of housing that's already rough for Houstonians as is, perhaps maybe added difficulty for that person who's coming into our country for the first time. Are there programs that you all are aware of, or are there uniquenesses for folks that may be coming in from other countries that this affordable housing space worth knowing about, or just worth considering as we think about that holistic view of how do we address affordable housing in Houston?
I think that's an interesting question, Dan. I know that at the Houston Housing Authority, we assist everyone who qualifies for our program that we have space for. But if we're talking about holistically, I think we're talking about there's going to be an increase of individuals here who are going to have challenges in getting some of the rental units, and how do we address that? I don't know if we have in 2 minutes the space and the time to go deep into that, because I think that that's a whole nother conversation that becomes emotional. And as we're taking these emotions and looking at our principles, the principle would be like, how do we right size the city to meet the residents as they come in, right? How do we become flexible and nimble and scalable and have some level of dexterity? And some of these policy and procedures are just so, they're antiquated, right? So I think that that's going to take a lot more, and a lot more research from Kinder.
I think there's a big outreach question there also. You know, from my research when I was with Texas Housers, one of the things that stuck out to me the most was that, you know, the Latino community is the most underrepresented in public housing in Houston, and in publicly subsidized housing. And we know that's the largest population in the state of Texas at this point. And so what can we be doing to make subsidized housing, or, you know, housing subsidies more appealing or more accessible to communities who are maybe less willing to be involved in public programs, less willing or less able to be involved for a number of reasons?
All right. To Cupid's point, that was probably its own standalone discussion, but I do appreciate you all grappling with it, and offering some thoughts on how that population. Oh, Laura, I'm sorry.
No. I was just thinking, to your point, Libby, it's a cultural issue in some degree, and a very difficult one. Yeah.
All right, folks, we're gonna leave it there. Cupid, Libby, Laura, thank you each so very much for lending yourself and your expertise to this conversation today. It is so very much appreciated. And so as we are now moving into the wrap up, again, thank you panelists for being here with us today, sharing your perspectives and on your work. Once again, thank you to Wells Fargo for their continued support of our housing, State of Housing report. We very much appreciate that. And thank you to you, our audience, for your interest and engagement with your questions and being part of this discussion today. On our screen right now, you are seeing information about the report as well as the dashboard. I am not sure whether or not Tableau Public is back up, but it should be back up at some point. And at that point, we look forward to you all being able to access that dashboard and taking advantage of the data that are there. As we wrap up, I want to put a plug out there for the Kinder Institute. Our next event is going to be October 30th, a discussion led by our Education Research Center here at Kinder, the Houston Education Research Consortium, which will focus on student mobility taking place here in the Houston area. In addition to that, we will be having a conversation with Robert Santos on November 8th. Robert Santos is the director of the U.S. Census Bureau, and we will be holding that conversation as part of the Kinder Institute Forum at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston. You can learn more and register for those events at our website, kinder.rice.edu. Thank you all once again. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Steve. Have a good day.